When you read the reviews of this film, I mean, they're overall really, really positive, but I noticed in each one, there seems to be a different perspective on what the film is actually about.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering from your perspective, if you could just tell us as the director of this film, what do you think the film's about?
I think it's about multiple things, and so I think it's a good thing that different people are seeing different thematic issues, different themes in the film, because I think what's happening is people are bringing things to the film, and the film is like this reflection, and so not everybody's going to get the same thing out of it. For me, it's a coming-of-age story about this very particular neighborhood that I'm from in Miami, that the playwright Tarell McCraney is from. But it's also about the idea of masculinity, and then about the performance of masculinity. I've always say it's about anything. It's about how this sort of conversation of nature versus nurture, and how people can begin to perform what they think the world is expecting of them.
You mentioned that the film is an adaptation of a play by Tarell McCraney. It's called In Moonlight, Black Boys Look Blue. When you first read the play, when it first got into your hands, what was it that made you say, this needs to be made into a feature film?
Part of it was really personal. Tarell and I grew up in the same neighborhood, went to the same schools.
What neighborhood is that?
It's called Liberty City. It's like the South Central of Miami.
Okay.
I would describe it. There's a guy named Trick Daddy and Trick Daddy Dollars and Trina. They're both from Liberty City.
Yeah.
But Tarell wrote this thing, and it was sort of autobiographical. And yet, I didn't know Tarell growing up, but there were so many ways our lives kind of dovetailed that when I read it, I just saw myself in it. And the way I describe it is Tarell had basically taken like the memories of my memories and translated them to the stage. And I thought it would be great to translate that to the screen.
When you say that your lives dovetailed in so many ways, what do you mean by that? In what ways?
Again, we went to the same schools, we were born on the same block.
Yeah.
Both our mothers struggled with this raging addiction to crack cocaine growing up in the 1980s. And that's a very specific experience, and I'd never seen anyone else convey it the way Tarell did in this play, and I'd never seen my life conveyed by someone I thought so clearly.
But you didn't know one another.
No, it's weird, man. I don't understand how. We went to different high schools, so Tarell is like a very celebrated playwright. I like to say Tarell McCraney is the more talented, more famous Barry Jenkins. And part of that is he got started in art much quicker than I did. He went to basically the Juilliard of Miami for high school, and I went to the high school depicted in the film. So our paths kind of split. But I like to think that if we had stayed on the same path, we would have known each other. But things happen for a reason.
So when you reached out to him, were you able to say, hey, man, like we have the same background, we have the same experience?
Nah, you know what happened? These really smart guys at a group called the Borscht Film Festival, they knew both myself and Tarell. They read the piece Tarell wrote, and then they contacted me. They didn't put us together until I'd read the play. And once I did, they were like, now you guys should meet.
Right.
And we began to work together.
And what was that like when you first ran into one another?
It was kind of intense because we didn't run into each other. I went to Miami specifically to meet him.
Okay,
to
right,
talk to him about the play. He was very kind and very gracious. And this was right before he became a MacArthur genius. And so we were going to work together on the piece. But then he got really busy and really, really famous. And so he said he trusted me to go off and make the adaptation myself.
So I want to go a bit deeper in the film. Moonlight is based around a character named Chiron. You see him at 3 stages in his life. First, he's a little child. Then he becomes sort of a frustrated teenager, a bullied teenager. And then you see him as sort of a hardened adult. So what is it not just about him, but about his journey that fascinated you?
One, I like the idea, masculinity, male masculinity, black male masculinity. These are very esoteric terms, I wanted to see those things represented in flesh and blood, you know, and I wanted to see somebody go through the evolution of this process. So this idea of nurture versus nature can actually be tested, with flesh and blood actors, enacting, these what I felt like were very visceral scenes. And I like the idea that, we cast 3 different actors to play the part at each age. And and the adult story, this guy Trevante Rhodes, who's like an ex, 100-meter track athlete. The guy runs like a 10, 200 meters. He's very rocked up and big. And in the first story, we have this little kid who loves to dance, and perform as Michael Jackson. And to look into this grown man's eyes and still be able to see that child, to me, it would be, again, like instead of making it an intellectual discussion of the performance of masculinity, we could actually show it, that this person begins as one thing and then to survive in the world, builds up this literal musculature, this armature, to protect himself from having to deal, with being vulnerable.
That musculature is one of the more fascinating things about the whole movie that you take away. So if you haven't seen it, so in the beginning of the film, Chiron is, again, this skinny, kind of vulnerable kid. And by the end of the film, he's jacked. He's huge. And he just got out of jail not too long from when you see him. That's a really big contrast. Can you talk a little bit more about how deliberate that contrast was and what's to be represented by the physical transformation of the character?
I wanted it to be very jarring for the audience,
Yeah.
Like literally that this person has physically become someone else. And I wanted it to be represented as an attempt, literally, to erase himself, I like to think of the movie as a character who's retreating within himself, And so he's putting up, like literally just building up this firmament, arming himself. And the idea is, you know what? The world is not going to see me anymore.
Right.
I'm going to show the world what I want to be seen of me. And yet at the same time, I wanted to do it in a certain way where you have that initial reaction, and then over the course of the third story, you start to realize you're looking at the same person, and you're witnessing somebody trying to bury themselves. But none of us can really truly do that. At our core, we're always going to be that person that's the essence of us.
It's really remarkable, watching the film, and if you haven't seen the film yet, you really should. You'll see this. Is that by the time the third actor that plays Chiron, the grown-up Chiron, you really can see, even though he is this tough guy, the vulnerability of the young child within him.
Yeah, we when we cast the film, right away I decided I didn't care so much about the actors looking like one another.
Right.
That would have just been impossible.
Yeah.
It was more important to have the actors have the same feeling. And in film school, there's this book by Walter Murch called In the Blink of an Eye. If you're out there and you're studying film, it is like a 100-page book. It's really short. It's the best thing you can ever read.
In the Blink of an Eye.
In the Blink of an Eye,
Okay.
by Walter Murch, he talks about the eyes being the window into the soul. And he's an editor, so he literally says when you cut, you're putting up a barrier between the audience, and the characters on screen. What I felt like was, if you could look into these guys' eyes and see the same person, then we can have this continuum where you get to the end where Trevante Rhodes is all jacked up, but Alex Hibbert, who plays him in the first story, is still inside there. And so it was all about is the sort of spirituality and the emotion of the characters as reflected in their eyes.
There's so many powerful moments in the movie, and we don't have a whole lot of time, so I want to get to a couple of them. One in particular that's really affecting is Chiron's first sexual experience. It's with his friend, Kevin. There's a lot going on here. I want to point out that most people so far haven't seen this film yet. So they're sitting on the beach. They're next to one another. They're kind of ribbing one another. They've just kind of smoked a joint, and then something kind of intimate happens. What were you trying to get across during that scene?
That scene is, I'm glad you mentioned it. It's like, for me, like one of the most pivotal scenes in the film. I approached this story as an ally. I'm a straight black man.
Yeah.
And yet I feel like I'm an ally to LGBTQ causes. And Tarell McCraney is a very out playwright, and so I wanted to preserve his voice. And that scene is written in Tarell's voice. I don't have that first person perspective, and I think empathy can only get you so far, and so having Tarell's voice and having his life experiences at the core of the piece and the source material was really important. And I wanted to nail that scene. It just had to be nailed. I think the whole movie spins on the idea of this transference, of trust and emotion, and having someone allow you the space to embrace your identity. And I think in that scene, both those actors, they do it in such a delicate and sort of caring way that you can see, the scene that happens next, over the next 2 minutes, where there's this huge betrayal, It only works because that scene is just so genuinely intimate between those two actors.
But you, as a director, you had to make a choice because it's a largely implied scene. It's not overly explicit, and you gave a lot of space to that scene. Was that something you did intentionally?
I did it intentionally because I wanted the sequence or that scene to have this not necessarily innocence, but I wanted it to be positive. I wanted it to be a positive first sexual experience. I didn't want it to be like under cloak and dagger, or there's this tension or things like that. I wanted it to be a very kind, caring scene, because in the third story, those two characters reunite. And I think they reunite because something genuinely was transferred in that moment.
Those two characters is maybe the most fascinating thing about the film, because the thing about Kevin as opposed to Chiron is that, well, he's into men and women. He seems more at peace with his sexuality than Chiron is. He doesn't seem quite as confused as Chiron is.
And yet, in the betrayal, he does the same thing. He begins to perform this version of hyper-masculinity rather than, be open about who he is. Once the world starts to assert itself, he does the same thing that everyone else is doing in that world. He starts to perform. And, again, I'm trying not to reveal
I know.
what happens.
I want to say it so much.
But I do think in the third story, though, he has gotten to a place where the journey that we're witnessing the character Black go through, Chiron go through, Kevin's already been through that, And you're right, he arrives at a place where he's at peace with himself and he's accepted himself. And I love, what Andre Holland does with that character is He's not pushing. He's not pulling. He's just there, as a guide for Chiron. Because the last 20 minutes happens in real time. And you just see this guy just going, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
At your pace. At your pace.
Yeah, kind of. I've been there. Like I know what you're going through.
Exactly.
And we can get there together.
Exactly.
One thing I was struck by when I watched this film was kind of the different notions of how love is portrayed in this film. So without giving too much away, there's a complicated love between Chiron and his mother, who's suffering from a drug addiction. Teresa, portrayed by Janelle Monáe, she's a neighbor. She loves him, even though she really doesn't have to. She loves him in the community. And then there's a third kind of love, the love he feels for Kevin, but which, when he gives out, Kevin then returns and then becomes quite violent afterwards. What did you want to say about love in this film?
Exactly what you just said, bro. That it takes many, many different forms, and it comes from unexpected places. The fourth love, I would say, is between Mahershala Ali's character Juan and Little in the first story, which is, we open with this drug deal going on, and Ali is such a great actor. He plays on House of Cards. It's this very smooth,
Remy.
He plays Remy Dan. This very smooth, debonair kind of guy. Then I've seen him in the film Kicks, where he's playing literally like a neighborhood hustler. He can be evil one moment and he can be like an angel and the next. And I think that the trust, and sort of like the caring that he shows for Little in the first story, I think it ripples throughout all the way to the end of the film, where Chiron, Black, has started to perform as Juan, but it's the wrong version,
Right.
And I think because there was such a transference in the swimming scene, which it's something I can't even describe, something you just have to sort of experience and see. I think that even that love too is carried through, but it takes many forms and many shapes, and it's all valid to me.
Yeah, and again, without getting into individual specific scenes, it is also a meaning that love can be very complicated.
Exactly.
Love can be difficult, and it can be difficult for people to accept it.
Oh man, you beat me to it. That was my line, man. No, because I think the whole thing for the character Black Chiron is that people are always projecting this love. I think he creates a version of himself where he feels like he's unworthy of that love,
right?
And he doesn't accept it. You know? He won't allow himself to accept it, because if he does, all this armature he's built up, it's going to come crumbling down.
So it was built up, the physicality, the construct was built up to try and push away the love. Because when he is big, he does try to get that love again from his mother, but he pushes it away.
Right. But I will say, the one time he accepts love, in the very next moment, he gets betrayed. And I do think the reconciliation that he has with his mother in the third story, the great scene between Naomi Harris and Trevante Rhodes, I think it's the first moment where you start to see, a little bit of that armor start to come down.
You said earlier in the interview something really interesting. You said that you approached this film as a straight Black man, but yet you wanted to be an ally for the LGBTQ2 plus community.
An active ally. Because I think of, when the marriage equality bill was passed by the Supreme Court in the U.S., everybody put those rainbow filters on their Facebook, To me, that's being a passive ally. For me to have seen this story written by Tarell, and as a visual storyteller, already see a way to tell this story and not do it, that would be me not taking on my responsibility as an active ally, which I think is much more useful.
So what are you hoping this film can do for other people's perceptions of Black masculinity, of LGBT masculinity? What were you hoping to do with people's perceptions coming out of the theater?
I just want people to maybe through these characters understand how the world can affect some of these kids who grew up in this community like Tarell and I did, and how it can sort of like promote the idea of performing this version of masculinity that isn't truly who these men are, and sometimes can lead you to become something that you aren't necessarily. The other part of it is, people keep saying, "Oh, I've never seen a character like this," or "I've never seen a story like this," and I'm like, "Oh, I know people who live through this stuff all the time. We just don't see them represented in arts and letters very often." And what I would hope is, if people are walking down the street and you see a guy with a mouth full of grills, or you see a dude who's like, being really, really tough, you kind of think, instead of just seeing that guy and judging him, oh, he came from somewhere, there's a story. Maybe I can understand a little bit more of why he's that way. I can understand a little bit more of what he's going through. I can empathize with him, or at least make an attempt to.
I want to get to that just in a second, but I want to talk about the how. I can only imagine that coming into this film as a straight Black man, there were challenges. Yeah. There were moments that you had to think carefully about how you're going to portray the people in this film. So how did you negotiate that perspective as a straight black man with portraying and telling the story of a gay black man?
I tried to not like intellectually consider that too much. I try to just I describe it as chopping wood. Like filmmaking.
What do you mean?
Filmmaking to me, it's a very blue collar art form. There's all these cameras and all these people. There's just so much going on. That if you start to think of it in these more theological terms or thematic terms, you kind of like cannot see the trees for the forest. I don't know if that makes any sense.
You got to do the work.
Yeah, you can't do the work.
Yeah.
And so to me, everything about it was work. And the scene on the beach was a perfect example, which is probably, as a straight man, the most complex scene in the film for me to shoot. But I remember, and I'll try to tell the story without giving away too much. You guys can edit this afterwards, right?
Sure can, yeah.
So we were approaching that scene. You've seen the movie, and I was talking to the two guys, and they were both really, 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 really nervous. Partly because they had never performed a sex scene, in a film before.
Yeah.
They had hardly acted at all. I never directed a sex scene. Just all around. We're all green as hell. But we get there, and the one kid, Jerome, who plays Kevin, he'd asked me, he said, so Barry, what is this scene? And I was like, it's in the script. It's exactly the scene. Again, I'm trying to make it just chopping wood. And I go, Jarrell, are you a virgin? He goes, no, I'm not a virgin. I was like, okay. Was the person you lost your virginity to more experienced? Were you same experience? He's like, no, she was more experienced. I was like, was it a good experience? He said, yeah, it was. She was really kind. And now I like the actor to sort of talk their way into the solution. I don't want to give it. So I got quiet, and he said, is this the first time Kevin has kissed another man? I said, no, it's not the first time Kevin has kissed another man. Then I got really quiet, and I just watched him, and he said, it's the first time Chiron has kissed another man? I didn't say anything, and he said, oh, it's the first time Chiron has kissed anyone. I said, yes.
Yeah.
And that's what the scene became about, And so I tried to approach everything like that, Let's make it personal, If we're nervous, let's get comfortable and just find a way to chop the wood,
So what are you hoping? Well, you mentioned something interesting earlier. You mentioned that when you see people walking down the street, whether they're all jacked up, whether they're wearing gold teeth, you want people to be able to empathize. There aren't a lot of movies like Moonlight. There aren't a lot of movies that take that approach to black men and to masculinity that you do here. So just what will it take for those themes? What will it take for those issues to show up more often in film and television?
I think there needs to be a balance. I think these stories do exist, Again, I don't think they're told at the same rate as some of these other stories, It's funny, somebody was mentioning Tupac, and it was some video. It was like either All Eyes on Me or Hit 'Em Up, some like really, really aggressive, like thugged out video. And I said, oh, that same album had Dear Mama, So I think we just need to have a balance of this imagery, a balance, of our representations of black masculinity in arts and letters. And then I think, I think we'll get a more three-dimensional portrait of these people, because I feel like in this film, we're representing actual real lives that are being lived in an actual neighborhood that Tarell and I are from. And it's unfortunate that those neighborhoods and those people are more voiceless than others, It's just about creating a voice.
And just finally, in making this film, did you learn anything about your own perceptions of masculinity and male sexuality?
I did, for sure. I started to realize, even myself, how I was performing in a certain way.
What do you mean?
As we're getting a little personal here now. As a black director, I do a lot of commercials, and I'll walk onto a set, and as the only black person on set, and as the boss of the set, I feel like I have to prove that I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have to prove that I am, the person who is running the set, and sometimes that process intellectually will lead me to start to perform in ways that I shouldn't be performing because it's not me. And so I started to realize in working with the actors, a lot of these very small, subtle ways, I was in my own life doing some of the things that we were trying to depict in these characters. And it was fascinating, man.
When you say, what were you trying to do? What were you doing that you caught yourself doing?
Oh, I would just, sometimes, someone asks you a question and there's a kind way to answer and there's a not so kind way to answer,
Yeah.
There's a way to answer at all. And sometimes, there's these microaggressions, I like to call them, that I think sometimes we perform, as men or as, the alpha this or the CEO of that, that aren't necessarily who we are. They're just a part of what we assume is the role that we've been assigned to play,
Barry Jenkins, thanks so much for coming into the studio today to talk to us about this film, man.
Cool, thanks for having me.